All right, so now that we've learned a whole bunch of tools, you've probably noticed that there's been different ways that I have gone about editing the model outside of any particular tool when it comes to reshaping stuff, right? We use all these tools to build things, but when it comes to actually, like, I don't want to say sculpting, but reshaping these things, there have been a few different ways I've been doing it. For example, at the beginning here, I had vertexes that I was using, let's see, the scale tool to kind of reshape like this, or if I needed more space between the edge loops, I might raise them up a little bit, right? But when we were handling faces and we were extruding things, I was using the move first for sure, especially when we're extruding, and then I was using the scale tool to kind of reshape and remold, things like that. Or, nope, just kidding. When it came to edges and using edge loops, it was sort of equal amounts of moving and scaling, right? It depended on what I was doing, but you can move edge loops up and down. You can also bring up your tool settings and move them along the surface, which won't work. That's a bad example. Here we go. Here's a good example. So I can slide this edge loop along the surface, put it where I need it to, as opposed to moving it and it changes, right? So moving and scaling really for all three of these just in different orders depending on what I'm doing. And so the question becomes, well, which one do you use when? And the answer is it depends. And I'm sorry that that's just such a wishy-washy answer, but unfortunately it really does depend. It depends on what you're trying to do. It depends on where you need to change it, and it depends on how you, who is a different human than me, thinks about 3D space and how to interact with this 3D space, and what buttons you would like to press, right? So if you get 10 different people who work in this program, you'll get 10 different answers as to what to do. Generally speaking, when it comes to vertexes, those are probably the hardest thing to select. Works really well if I need the whole top of something or the whole bottom of something, or and then see that didn't even work that well. It's probably one of the trickiest things to select because you can't see when you've done it wrong sometimes. I missed some there and I didn't notice it, right? It works better if I get the whole thing, but if I only needed a few of them, that's a little different, right? So I used it at the beginning because there's not much going on here, and it worked out really well from this perspective at first when everything was in line with each other. Now, not so much. Look at this. The top and the bottom are no longer aligned with the outsides. Everything's a different size. So that little dragging, selecting trick isn't going to work anymore. It'll only work sort of across in slices, right? Much easier to select are edge loops. You double click, you get an edge loop. And that's great for what's going around here. And scaling them is really great for getting it to reshape, although keep in mind I am having to scale not asymmetrically, but the X is different than the Z. Let me undo that. And it also ties into where the resolution is. So edge loops are distinctly tied to how much resolution you have. And so paying attention to those, that's a really good thing. And I know a lot of people in this field emphasize that. The faces I was almost only dealing with as I was constructing it. As I was building this up, if I go into face mode, in order to extrude, right? That was extrude because I was extruding faces. If you're more comfortable, extrude edge loops. You can extrude edges. Undo. There we go. Make sure it says undo. Poly extrude before you continue on, right? But that was basically the only time I was moving faces when I was extruding. And the same goes for if we bring up the other things. This top part of the hammer, right? I extruded, let's see, these faces. Oh, not just those. There we go. Those faces out of the front of the hammer. I extruded these faces out of the top of the hammer, and then extruded these faces out of the back of the hammer, right? Um, and then I basically never selected faces again, in part because a face is made up of 4 edges and 4 vertexes. So it's kind of like almost a next step. I know it's a component, but it is kind of containing a couple different aspects. And so it's a little bit harder to work with. You're not going to select faces and then like these faces, right? How am I going to select this row of faces perfectly, even if I can get it? If I go to scale this, I'm scaling 2 edge loops, this edge loop and this edge loop, right? So I'm scaling more than if I was just in edge mode and scaling 1 edge loop at a time. All right, so that's another reason why faces are great for extruding. I don't really use them much otherwise, unless I'm deleting. If you want to delete one small thing in the middle, delete edge vertex, right? If there's an extra edge loop that you just do not want anymore, double click it, edit mesh, delete edge vertex. However, if you're looking at the head of this hammer going, I hate this, it's terrible, I need to start from scratch, don't delete edge vertex, it won't work. You have to select the faces and hit delete. So deleting faces off the whole thing, pretty easy. Get you a new opening, start from scratch, go again. All right. So it depends on what you're trying to do. It depends on what you're trying to fix. It depends on what you're trying to model. You will all eventually have different workflows. I will, do things in class a certain way, but you might have a different way of thinking of things. And that's okay. This is when it comes to modeling stuff. As long as you end up with, lots of all quads and your edge loops are clean, there's no right answer as to how you get there. Now, if you end up with, let me break this here for a second. Multicut. Oh, already broke it. Well, if you end up with half an edge loop going around like this and it's all crooked and there's no reason for it to be like that. Oh, see, I'm not even in the right tool. There we go. It doesn't even go around because I accidentally split this. Check that out, right? That's no good, right? We don't want to see that. And we want to make sure when we get rid of what we say delete edge vertex. Mesh tools, edit mesh, delete edge vertex. And we go into vertex mode and kind of take a look around, make sure there are none hanging out there, right? But if the mesh is clean, if it has edge loops in the right spots and it's the shape you want it, I don't care how you got there. There's no, I'm going to look at this and it's going to kind of be a little bit of show your work. I'll be able to see, get an idea of how you did it because all of your work is here in history. But I'm not going to sit there and say, oh, you really should have been extruding faces and not edges. Unless it breaks, in which case I'll point out maybe that, where it went wrong. But how you manipulate this, whether it's, you can go in here, if you want to select vertexes and scale that, great. If you want to select edge loops and scale that, great. Whichever way you think of to handle this model, that is entirely up to you. And so try things out, and as long as you're keeping, the mesh clean, you'll be good to go.